Walter Brennan died on a Tuesday morning in March of 1987 at 73 years old, sitting in his favorite chair on the porch of his farmhouse in Grundy County, Iowa. He'd been watching the sunrise, same as he'd done every morning for 50 years. His coffee cup was still in his hand when his wife Margaret found him an hour later, the coffee gone cold, Walter gone with it. The funeral was 3 days later at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Grundy Center. The church was packed. Walter had been farming in the county since 1937, had lived through the Depression, survived World War II, raised 4 sons, and never missed a Sunday Mass in 50 years. People came from 3 counties to pay their respects. His 4 sons sat in the front pew. Robert, the oldest, at 49, James, 46, Thomas, 43, and Daniel, the youngest, at 41. All of them had grown up on the farm. All of them knew how to drive a tractor before they could drive a car. All of them had heard their father say the same thing 1,000 times. Never buy what you can't pay cash for. Walter Brennan had lived by that rule his entire life. He'd bought his first 160 acres in 1937 for $22 an acre, paying cash he'd saved working as a railroad laborer for 3 years. He'd added another 160 acres in 1952, again paying cash. By the time he died in 1987, he owned 640 acres free and clear, had equipment that was old but paid for, and had $47,000 in the bank. It wasn't a fortune, but it was his. No debt, no bank breathing down his neck, no sleepless nights worrying about payments. At the funeral, Father O'Brien gave the eulogy. He talked about Walter's faith, his dedication to family, his commitment to the community. But what people remembered most was something Father O'Brien said near the end. Walter Brennan was a man who understood the difference between what you want and what you need. He lived simply, saved carefully, and never confused the two. In an age of credit and debt and keeping up with the neighbors, Walter kept his own counsel. He knew that the only true security comes from owning what you have, not from borrowing what you don't. After the service, after the burial, after the luncheon in the church basement, the 4 Brennan brothers met at their father's farmhouse to discuss the future. Their mother Margaret was staying with Robert's family for a few days, giving the boys space to figure things out. They sat around the kitchen table where they'd eaten thousands of meals as kids. The table was old, scarred with decades of use, but solid, like everything else their father had owned. Robert, the oldest, spoke first. He'd always been the natural leader, the one who organized things, made decisions. "We need to figure out what to do with the farm," he said. "Dad left it to all 4 of us equally, 160 acres each. The question is, do we keep it together or divide it up?" James, the second oldest, had been farming with their father for the past 20 years. He lived just down the road, had his own 320 acres that he'd bought in 1975. "I'd like to keep farming it," James said. "If the rest of you are willing, I could farm all 640 acres, pay you rent on your shares." Thomas shook his head. He was a lawyer in Des Moines, had left farming 15 years ago. "I think we should sell it. Land prices are decent right now, even after the crash. We could each walk away with a good chunk of change." Daniel, the youngest, hadn't said anything yet. He lived in Cedar Rapids, worked as an engineer at Rockwell Collins. He'd been off the farm longest, had the least connection to it. But he was the one who'd spent the most time with their father in the last few years, coming home on weekends to help with repairs, to talk, to listen. "What would Dad want?" Daniel asked quietly. The other 3 looked at him. "Dad would want us to keep it in the family," Daniel said, "and he'd want whoever farms it to do it his way. No debt, pay cash for everything, don't borrow." Robert snorted. "That's not realistic anymore, Danny. You can't farm that way in 1987. Equipment costs too much. You need capital, you need financing. Dad's way worked for him, but times have changed." "Have they?" Daniel asked. "Because I watched half the county go bankrupt in the last 5 years doing it the modern way. Dad survived. They didn't." There was an uncomfortable silence. It was true. The farm crisis of the 1980s had wiped out hundreds of farmers in Iowa. But Walter Brennan had survived because he hadn't been leveraged. He'd had no debt to service when grain prices collapsed. They talked for another hour and finally agreed on a plan. James would farm the land. He'd pay the other 3 brothers rent $80 per acre per year. That was $12,800 per year to be split 3 ways, or about $4,267 each for Robert, Thomas, and Daniel. James would keep all the crop proceeds, but would be responsible for all expenses. It seemed fair. Everyone agreed. What none of them discussed, what they didn't think to discuss, was whether James would follow their father's philosophy. Would he farm debt-free, paying cash for everything? Or would he do what everyone else was doing in 1987, leveraging his operation to expand and modernize? They found out soon enough. In the spring of 1988, James bought a new combine, a John Deere 9500, one of the first of that model to come to Grundy County. The machine cost $142,000. James financed the whole amount through John Deere credit at 9.5% interest over 7 years. His monthly payment was $2,970. Over the life of the loan, he'd pay $183,000 total for a machine that cost $142,000. When Daniel heard about it, he drove up from Cedar Rapids to talk to his brother. They met at James's farm on a Saturday morning in April. "What the hell are you doing?" Daniel asked. "Dad's been dead a year and you're already going into debt?" James was defensive. "I needed a combine, Danny. The old 6600 finally died. I couldn't fix it anymore. And I'm farming 960 acres now, my 320 plus Dad's 640. I need modern equipment. So buy a used one," Daniel said. "Pay cash like Dad would have." "There aren't any good used ones available," James said. "And even if there were, they'd still cost 60 or 70,000. I don't have that kind of cash sitting around." "Then wait until you do," Daniel said. "Make do with what you have. Hire someone to do custom harvesting until you can afford to buy your own combine with cash." James shook his head. "That's Dad's way. That's not my way. Times have changed. You have to leverage your operation to stay competitive. This isn't 1940 anymore." "No," Daniel said. "It's 1988, 6 years after the worst farm crisis since the Depression, and you're doing exactly what all those failed farmers did. Buying equipment you can't afford with money you don't have." They argued for another 20 minutes, but Daniel couldn't change his brother's mind. He drove back to Cedar Rapids, frustrated and worried. Over the next 5 years, James continued to expand and modernize, convinced that his father's ways were outdated. In 1990, he bought 2 new tractors to replace the aging equipment he'd inherited. A John Deere 4455 and a 4255, both bought brand new from the dealership in Grundy Center. The 4455 cost $67,000. The 4255 cost $54,000. James financed both of them through John Deere credit at 8.9% interest over 5 years. His monthly tractor payments alone were now $2,156, on top of his combine payment of $2,078. When Daniel heard about the tractors, he drove up from Cedar Rapids again, had another argument with his brother in James's machine shed. "You're digging yourself deeper," Daniel said, looking at the shiny new green tractors. "You're now paying almost $5,000 a month just on equipment. That's $60,000 a year. That's more than Dad's entire farm operation cost to run." "I'm farming 3 times as much ground as Dad did," James shot back. "You can't compare. The scale is different. The economics are different." "The debt is different too," Daniel said. "Dad had none. You have hundreds of thousands." But James wouldn't listen. In his mind, he was doing what successful modern farmers did. Every farm magazine he read, Every conference he attended, every conversation he had with other farmers, they all confirmed the same thing. You had to expand, you had to modernize, you had to leverage your operation to stay competitive. In 1992, James bought a new planter, a 12-row Case IH-1200, financed for $42,000. In 1993, he bought a new grain cart for $18,500, financed. In 1994, he bought another 320 acres from a retiring farmer named Ed Sullivan. The land cost $1,150 an acre, which meant $464,000 total. James put $50,000 down and financed the rest at 7.5% over 20 years. His land payment was $3,375 per month, or $40,500 per year. By 1995, James Brennan was farming 1,280 acres with a fleet of modern equipment. He looked successful. When he drove through Grundy Center in his newer pickup truck, when people saw his shiny equipment in the fields, they thought he was doing well. Other farmers envied him. But the reality that kept James awake at night, was that he was drowning. His total debt in 1995 was $627,000. His monthly obligations between land payments and equipment payments were over $7,200. That was $86,400 per year just to service debt before he paid for seed, fertilizer, fuel, repairs, insurance, or anything else. In a good year, when corn was $350 and beans were $7, he could handle it. His gross income would be around $450,000, his expenses around $200,000, leaving him about $250,000. After debt service of $86,400, he'd clear $163,600. That sounded good on paper, but it only took one bad year, one drought, one price collapse, one major equipment failure, and the whole house of cards would fall. Meanwhile, Robert, the oldest brother, had taken a completely different path with his inheritance. He'd taken his share of their father's estate, approximately $45,000, after everything was settled in 1988. And on the advice of a broker he'd met at a Chamber of Commerce meeting, he invested it in the stock market, specifically in technology stocks. Companies with names like Cisco, Microsoft, Dell, Oracle, companies that Robert didn't really understand, if he was honest. He couldn't explain what Cisco Systems actually did. But his broker, a smooth-talking man named Greg Winters, who wore expensive suits and drove a BMW, assured Robert that this was the future. "The internet is going to change everything," Greg would say, leaning back in his leather chair, charts and graphs spread across his desk. "We're witnessing the birth of a new economy. The companies that position themselves in this space are going to make their investors incredibly wealthy. Your father's generation couldn't have imagined this kind of opportunity. For a while, it worked beautifully. Robert's $45,000 turned into $72,000 by 1994, then $112,000 by 1996, then $180,000 by early 1998. Robert was checking his portfolio value multiple times a day, watching it climb, feeling like the smartest person in the room. He started going to investment seminars, reading books about day trading. He subscribed to financial newsletters, set up a home office with multiple computer monitors showing stock charts. In 1997, he quit his job as a sales manager at an agricultural supply company where he'd worked for 22 years. He was going to be a full-time investor. His wife, Karen, was terrified. "Bob, you have a good job," she'd said when he told her his plan. "You have benefits, you have security. This stock market thing could end tomorrow." "It's not going to end," Robert had said, his voice full of certainty. "This is the new economy, Karen. The old rules don't apply. Dad was smart for his time, but this is different. This is the internet age. Companies don't need factories and farmland anymore. They just need good ideas and good code. The sky's the limit." Karen had grown up on a farm herself, had watched her own father struggle through the 1980s crisis. "That's what everyone was saying in 1982, she'd said quietly. That farmland would only go up, that the old rules didn't apply, then everything crashed. But Robert had stopped listening. He'd made $135,000 in paper profits in 3 years. He felt invincible. Thomas, the lawyer in Des Moines, had also diverged from their father's path. He'd used his inheritance to invest in real estate, specifically rental properties. In 1988, he'd bought a duplex in a working-class neighborhood of Des Moines for $78,000, putting $15,000 down and financing the rest. In 1989, he'd bought a single-family home for $62,000. Same structure, $12,000 down. In 1992, he'd bought another duplex for $95,000, $18,000 down. His plan was simple: buy properties in decent neighborhoods, rent them out, have the tenants pay the mortgage, and build equity. On paper, it looked brilliant. His total monthly mortgage obligations were $118.20, and he was collecting $2,100 in rent. He was cash flow positive $200 per month, or $3,260 per year, while building equity in 3 properties worth a combined $235,000. Thomas felt smart. Smarter than his father, if he was honest with himself. Real estate was the path to wealth. Everyone said so. His law school friends who'd gotten into real estate in the 1980s were now wealthy. They had multiple properties, drove nice cars, took expensive vacations. But what Thomas hadn't accounted for, what the success stories never mentioned, was the reality of being a landlord. The tenant in the first duplex stopped paying rent in 1993, and it took Thomas 4 months to evict him. 4 months of mortgage payments out of his own pocket, plus legal fees. The tenant in the single-family home had 3 dogs that destroyed the carpeting and damaged the hardwood floors. $8,200 in repairs. The second duplex had foundation problems that didn't show up in the inspection. When Thomas noticed cracks in the walls in 1994, he had an engineer look at it. The foundation was settling, needed to be reinforced. The estimate was $28,000. Thomas had to take out a home equity loan on his own house to pay for it. By 1995, Thomas was spending 20 hours a week managing his rental properties, dealing with tenants, arranging repairs, chasing late rent payments, showing units to prospective renters. His law practice was suffering because he was distracted, stressed, exhausted. His wife Rebecca was frustrated because he was never home, always dealing with some property emergency. "I thought this was supposed to be passive income," Rebecca said one evening, after Thomas had spent 3 hours at one of the duplexes dealing with a burst pipe. "This is a second full-time job." "It'll get easier," Thomas had said, though he didn't believe it. "Once I get the properties stabilized, once I get good tenants in place, it'll run itself." But it never did. There was always something, always a problem, always an expense he hadn't budgeted for. Only Daniel, the youngest, had followed their father's advice. He'd taken his inheritance, approximately $43,000, and added it to the money he already had saved. He put it all in a regular savings account at his credit union in Cedar Rapids. It earned 3.2% interest, which everyone told him was foolish. "You're losing money to inflation," Robert told him at a family Christmas dinner in 1994. "That money sitting in a savings account is actually worth less every year. You need to invest it. Make it grow." "I'm comfortable where it is," Daniel had said. "You're being irrational," Robert had pressed. "I've made over $100,000 in the market in the last 3 years. You could have done the same. Instead, you've made what? $3,000 in interest?" "I've still got all my principal," Daniel had said quietly. "How much of yours is yours? And how much is just paper profits that could disappear tomorrow?" Robert had laughed. "They're not going to disappear. The market only goes up in the long run. That's a proven fact." But Daniel remembered sitting on the porch with his father 2 years before the old man died, having a conversation he'd never forgotten. They'd been talking about life, about farming, about money, about risk. "Dad," Daniel had asked, "don't you ever wish you'd taken more risks, borrowed some money, expanded the farm, made more money? Maybe you'd have been rich." Walter had been quiet for a long moment, rocking slowly in his chair. looking out over his land. The sun was setting, painting the fields gold. Then he'd said, "Son, I've slept easy every night of my adult life. Never once woke up at 3 in the morning worrying about how I was going to make a payment. Never once had a banker calling me, pressuring me, threatening to take what's mine. Never once had to sell something I wanted to keep just to stay afloat." He'd paused, still rocking. "I've seen men with twice as much land as me lose everything because they borrowed more than they could pay back. Seen men who were smarter than me, harder workers than me, better farmers than me, lose their farms because they made their biggest investments at the wrong time. I'd rather have less and own it than have more and have the bank own it. I'd rather sleep easy than worry about being rich." Then Walter had looked at Daniel, and his eyes had been serious. "The world's going to try to sell you on debt, son. Banks will tell you it's smart to leverage. Salesmen will tell you that you need the newest, the best, the most expensive. Other people will make you feel like you're falling behind if you're not constantly expanding, constantly upgrading, constantly taking risks. But you remember this: most of those banks will foreclose on you if you miss 2 payments. Most of those salesmen don't care if you can actually afford what they're selling. And most of those other people are 1 bad year away from losing everything." Walter had gone back to looking at his land. "The only true security in this world is owning what you have, not owing anyone, not having payments hanging over your head, being able to weather the storms because you don't have debt eating you alive when times get hard. That's freedom. That's real wealth. Not having more stuff, having less worry." Daniel had never forgotten that conversation. So when his brothers were leveraging and investing and taking risks, when they were making what looked like smart modern decisions, when they were accumulating paper wealth and real debt, Daniel just kept his money safe. He drove a 1989 Honda Accord that he'd bought used for $6,800. He lived in a modest 3-bedroom house that he'd bought in 1985 for $67,000 and paid off in 1995. He saved 20% of his paycheck every single month, automatically transferred to savings before he could spend it on anything else. His wife Angela thought he was too conservative, too cautious. Her friends' husbands drove newer cars, took nicer vacations, lived in bigger houses. "We could afford a nicer place," she'd said more than once. "You make good money. We could upgrade." "We could also keep living below our means and retire early," Daniel would say. "We could have money saved for emergencies. We could sleep at night knowing we don't owe anyone anything." Angela didn't love it, but she didn't push him hard. She'd grown up poor, had watched her parents struggle with debt. She understood, on some level, what Daniel was trying to avoid. Then 1998 and 1999 happened. For James, the farmer, 1998 was a disaster. Grain prices collapsed. Corn fell to $2.10 a bushel, the lowest it had been in years. Soybeans dropped to $4.50. James had borrowed heavily, assuming prices would stay high, but they didn't. His crop income fell by 40%, while his debt payment stayed exactly the same. He missed a payment in November of 1998, then another in December. By January of 1999, he was 3 months behind on his combine payment and 2 months behind on his land payment. The bank started calling. In March of 1999, James called a family meeting. All 4 brothers gathered at their mother's house, now just Margaret and memories. James looked terrible. He'd lost 20 pounds, had dark circles under his eyes, looked 10 years older than he was. "I need help," James said. "I'm going to lose the farm if I don't get help." The room was quiet. Margaret, now 82, sat in her chair and cried quietly. "How much do you need?" Robert asked. 50,000 to catch up all my payments and give me breathing room," James said. "I'll pay you back, I swear. Once grain prices recover, they might not recover," Daniel said quietly. "Not any time soon. The fundamentals aren't there." James's face went red. "So you're just going to let me lose everything? Let Dad's farm get foreclosed?" "It's not Dad's farm anymore," Daniel said, his voice still quiet but firm. "You turned it into your farm. You're the one who took on all the debt. You're the one who didn't listen when I told you to follow Dad's advice. This isn't Dad's farm failing. This is your operation failing." "Danny's right," Thomas said. He looked exhausted himself. His rental properties were bleeding money. One of his tenants had trashed a house, causing $18,000 in damage. Another property had foundation problems that were going to cost $30,000 to fix. Thomas was leveraged on all three properties and couldn't afford the repairs. Robert didn't say anything. His face was pale. His tech stocks, the ones that had made him feel like a genius, had started to fall. The internet bubble was showing cracks. His $180,000 portfolio was down to $120,000 and dropping every day. "I can't help you," Robert finally said. "I'm barely hanging on myself." James looked at Daniel, the youngest brother, the one who'd always been the most conservative. "Danny, you've got money saved. You told me you had over 100,000 in the bank. I need 50. Loan me 50 and I can save the farm." Daniel felt all eyes on him, his mother's sad gaze, his brother's desperate faces. This was his father's land they were talking about, the land Walter Brennan had bought with his own hands' work, had farmed for 50 years, had left to his sons to preserve. But Daniel also remembered his father's voice. "Never loan money you can't afford to lose, and never enable someone to continue making bad decisions." "I can't do it, James," Daniel said. "You'll just use that money to delay the inevitable. You're $600,000 in debt. 50,000 isn't going to solve that. It's just going to prolong the pain. So you're going to let the bank take Dad's farm?" James's voice was rising now, angry and desperate. "No," Daniel said. "You're going to let the bank take it. You're the one who put it at risk. I begged you not to. I warned you. Dad would have warned you if he'd been alive. But you didn't listen, and now you're facing the consequences." James stood up, his chair scraping back hard. "I hope you can live with yourself," he said, and walked out. The foreclosure came in August of 1999. The bank took all 280 acres that James had been farming, including the 640 acres that had been their father's. They took the equipment too, everything. James and his wife moved to Waterloo, got jobs at the John Deere plant. They never farmed again. Meanwhile, Robert's tech portfolio continued to collapse. By March of 2000, when the dot-com bubble fully burst, his $180,000 was worth $35,000. He'd lost $145,000. Money that had been real, that could have been saved, was just gone. Robert had to go back to work, took a sales job that paid less than his old one. He and Karen had to downsize their house, sell their second car. The dream of early retirement was dead. Thomas lost 2 of his 3 rental properties. The maintenance costs and problem tenants had eaten all his equity. The bank foreclosed, and Thomas walked away, owing money. His credit was ruined. His law practice suffered because he'd been spending so much time trying to manage the properties. And Daniel still had his $120,000 in the bank, plus what he'd saved since. He'd never made the killing his brothers had dreamed of, but he'd never lost everything either. In 2001, the bank that had foreclosed on James's operation put the land up for auction. All 1,280 acres divided into parcels. Daniel attended the auction. Grain prices were still low. Land values were depressed. Not many buyers had cash. The 640 acres that had been their father's land sold for $1,800 an acre. Total price, just over $115 million. Daniel bid on it. He had money saved, plus he could get a loan if he needed one. He was the only Brennan brother in a position to do so. But as the auctioneer called for bids, Daniel found he couldn't do it. Couldn't bring himself to buy his father's land at a foreclosure auction, even though it would have been a good investment. It felt like profiting from his brother's failure, and he couldn't stomach it. The land sold to a corporation out of Illinois. Strangers would farm the land Walter Brennan had worked for 50 years. That night, Daniel drove to his mother's house. Margaret was 84 now, her health failing. She'd been heartbroken by James's foreclosure, by the loss of the family farm. Daniel sat with her on the porch, the same porch where his father had died 14 years earlier. "I'm sorry, Mom," Daniel said. "I should have bought it, should have kept it in the family." Margaret shook her head. "Your father wouldn't have wanted you to buy it out of sentiment. He would have wanted you to make a smart decision, and walking away was the smart decision." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Your father used to say, the easiest way to lose money is to try to save someone who's drowning in debt. You couldn't save James. None of us could. He made his choices." "And, he learned the hard way," Daniel said. "Yes," Margaret agreed. "He did. They all did, all except you." Margaret Brennan died 2 years later in 2003. The 4 brothers gathered for her funeral, the first time they'd all been in the same room since the foreclosure. James barely spoke to Daniel. The rift between them had never healed. But Daniel noticed something. James looked different. Older, obviously, but also calmer somehow, less driven, less stressed. After the funeral, Daniel approached his brother. "How are you doing?" he asked. James was quiet for a moment. "Better than I was," he finally said. "Losing the farm almost killed me, but working at the plant, having a regular paycheck, no payments except the house and car. I sleep now, Danny. I sleep through the night. Haven't done that since 1990. He looked at his youngest brother. "You were right. Dad was right. I just couldn't see it. I thought I was smarter than the old man, thought the rules didn't apply to me, and I lost everything, proving myself wrong." "I'm sorry," Daniel said. "Don't be," James said. "Best thing that ever happened to me was losing that farm. Took me 5 years to realize it, but it's true. I was working 90 hours a week, stressed all the time, risking everything every year. Now I work 40 hours, come home, spend time with my family. I'm happier now than I ever was farming." They reconciled that day, slowly, carefully. It would take years for the relationship to fully heal, but it started there. Robert never recovered from his stock market losses. He worked until he was 70, never able to retire early like he'd planned. He and Karen stayed together, but the financial stress had damaged their marriage in ways that never fully healed. Thomas rebuilt his law practice, but he never invested in real estate again. The rental property disaster had taught him that real estate isn't passive income, it's a second job. He stuck to his day job and saved conservatively. And Daniel kept working at Rockwell Collins, kept saving 20% of his paycheck, kept living modestly. He retired at 62 with over $800,000 in savings, a paid-off house, and no debt. He and his wife travel now, volunteer at their church, spend time with grandkids. He never made a fortune, but he never lost one either. In his home office, Daniel has a photograph on the wall. It's his father, Walter Brennan, standing next to an old farmall tractor in 1985, 2 years before he died. The old man is smiling, his hand on the tractor's fender. Behind him you can see the farm, 640 acres of paid-for land. Under the photo, Daniel had a plaque made. It says, "Never buy what you can't pay cash for. Walter Brennan, 1914, 1987. And below that, in smaller letters, 3 of his sons learned why the hard way. One listened. Daniel's grandson asked him once why he keeps that photo and plaque in such a prominent place. "Because," Daniel said, "the older I get, the more I realize how rare it is to actually follow good advice, instead of just agreeing with it." Everyone agreed with Grandpa Walter. Everyone nodded when he said you shouldn't buy what you can't afford. But only one of us actually did it. And that made all the difference. The farm crisis of the 1980s taught a lot of lessons, but those lessons had to be relearned in the tech bubble of the late 1990s, and they'll have to be learned again in the next crisis, whatever form it takes, because human nature doesn't change. The desire to get rich quick, to leverage and expand and take risks, it's always there. And there's always someone with a smooth voice and a compelling story telling you that this time is different, that the old rules don't apply anymore, that you'd be a fool not to take advantage of this opportunity. Walter Brennan knew better. He'd seen it all before in the 1920s, before the Depression. He knew that this time is never different. The details change, but the pattern stays the same. 3 of his sons had to learn that lesson the hard way, by losing everything. One of them was smart enough to listen. To